All right. For those who weren't with us at the beginning, we want to say hello and welcome again to our webinar today. My name is Daniel, and I'm here along with Jamie and Cara. And this is basically a presentation of a research that we've done in our first year of training, where we looked at the narrative around exclusions, focusing on the view of parents from parents of children with autism. So, the context for this research. This research we had undertaken was a continuation of the initial piece of research that we did at the start of our first year on the same placement. In that piece of research, we were looking at factors that were leading to exclusion in the local authority that we were placed in. As a part of it, we examined the literature for exclusions relating to children and young people with SEN. During the discussion with EPs in the local authority, it became clear that exclusions was an area of concern for this particular borough. It also brought our attention to the high number of exclusions for children and young people with autism. Now, this topic quickly became something that we were very passionate about and keen to hear from parents of children who have experienced exclusion, looking at the impact not only for the child, but also as a family.
So to begin with, what we did is we looked at published exclusion data in the Timpson Review of School Exclusions, which was published in 2019. There was this notable trend that children with a diagnosis of autism and had been granted an education, health and care plan, they were half as likely to be permanently excluded as children who had no SEN. And we were thinking this trend is probably driven by many different factors. So for example, provision allocated through their EHCP, that may have helped to reduce incidents that could have led to a school exclusion. Or perhaps there is something there about a changing narrative or changing understanding of a child's behaviour and what it's communicating once an EHC has been granted. However, then as we read further, there was a reversal of trends where we could see that children with a diagnosis of autism and an EHCP were actually nearly 3 times more likely to receive a fixed term exclusion. So perhaps this counterbalances the lower rates of permanent exclusions with an EHCP, or maybe behaviour is understood differently, maybe it's seen as less deliberate, and therefore it would warrant a fixed term rather than a permanent exclusion. We can also cynically question the reliability of the data, and it's cynical, but there is actually compelling evidence in the Timpson Review and also reports from the Children's Commissioner that off-rolling and unofficially excluding children with SEN is happening. And as a result, what are essentially permanent exclusions might not be visible in the data. So it's important to highlight that this is unlawful practice and it's a serious issue of concern. And that concern is compounded by the stories that are shared by families where they've explained that their child nor them have been included or consulted about any decisions about the child's future at that school. A big part of the literature review was this idea of a school-wide understanding of special educational needs and the tension between how behaviour is understood and what is actually enshrined in the school's behaviour policy. And often behaviour policies assume that there is an objective truth to a situation, such that consequences can then be applied fairly across all students. But this often reduces what is a very complex situation with many underlying and interactive factors. And actually a range of the papers found that when time is invested into building an accurate picture of a child's SEN, that preventative support can be tailored to their needs, and this actually does lead to fewer school exclusions. And finally, at the bottom, we were also curious about the themes of power and division. Given that schools are becoming more autonomous as well, this could create what could potentially be a greater power imbalance between school and the family if there are disagreements there. And one paper in particular that we've cited here, they indicated that the high number of fixed-term exclusions experienced by children with autism may reflect systemic problems in education, whereby schools and how they are laid out, the curriculum, the policies, overall, they benefit neurotypical people because they were generally been designed by neurotypical people. And the authors highlighted that, worryingly, this could lead to practices of seeking to modify behaviours associated with autism to fit in with what's considered a mainstream ideology of behaviour in an effort to avoid being excluded from school.
And two more themes came out of our literature review, and that was educational outcomes and emotional impact. Now, a key phrase that came out was this idea of disrupted educational pathways. It was a term used by Piri et al., but also was evident in other papers. And it described how usually a neurotypical child might have a transition from primary school to secondary school and then maybe on to college. However, children with autism and SEN often have a disrupted pathway. So they will have maybe a few more transitions. Either that is moving schools, or it is because of exclusion, or because the trying to find a provision that meets their needs. But even so, however they come about that move, that pathway for their education is disrupted. And when you think about attendance as well, because obviously young people with autism sometimes have comorbidities, or and are due to the research has shown that they are much more likely to have lower attendance, and that is for appointments, for medical appointments. So if you add that on top of the exclusions, that is quite a lot of time missed from their education. And then the emotional impact. So the literature we found discussed the emotional impact on parents. This kind of was a positive in terms of the literature referring to the mental health of parents rather than students was a positive for our research, because then it was find a gap in the literature. And Piri et al. Found that exclusions had an impact on the mental health of parents. And while this was a 3-year longitudinal study, the sample size was small, and they disclosed that they might not be generalizable for this reason. However, a Finnish study showed that parents found pupils' sense of belonging had been jeopardized due to the fact that they had been placed in different settings. So the barriers to the sense of belonging was also down to the stigma, which was also experienced by the parents in the study Kianar et al. And parents felt isolated and were concerned that their children were regarded as weird or being left out. And parents thought that the public or fellow parents were also judging their children. So there's a real sense of emotional impact on parents and on the children as well. And this is our research question.
So towards our methodology, to answer our research question, first and foremost, we knew that we needed to recruit parents with a child who had been given an autism diagnosis, and to ensure that there would be both commonalities and differences across the parent stories. We thought it was important to create a more homogeneous sample. So we did add in additional criteria as well. So that criteria was that their child needed to be or have been in Key Stage 3 at the time of exclusion, or at the time of some of their exclusions, whether it was singular or more. They had been granted an EHCP, a diagnosis of autism, and they had received one or more fixed term exclusion within the last 2 years from when we conducted the research. So in total, we interviewed 3 parent participants, and we took a narrative approach, which Dan will explain. And while the participants knew that this research was part of our doctorate study, we did emphasize that this was an opportunity to share their story. So what we did is we began by asking very broad framing questions about demographics. And then we asked each parent to begin their story wherever felt right, and to only share what felt comfortable. And the interviews lasted between 60 and 90 minutes.
Okay, so I'm just going to take you through how we analyze the data. So to analyze the stories of the participants, we used the 3D approach, which was over 6 phases. So in our first phase, we basically transcribed the interviews and checked for any errors amongst the transcripts, removing any extraneous words or utterances. Secondly, each transcript was restoried in chronological, with the events in chronological order, whilst preserving the words of the participant, because we wanted to make sure that the story was their own. Then the restored transcript was sent back to the participant for their approval to ensure that it was an accurate capture of their experiences. And then we moved on to phase 4, which was a holistic content analysis of each story. And this was us trying to understand how each section of the text is a part of their life story, considering the who, what, when, how, as well as the intentions of the participants, the parents, and the others, the people mentioned in their stories. Discovering the meaning and also the importance of the story to the participant. So phase 5, we were looking at the interaction between both the personal and the social aspects of their story. So this was analyzing the text for the personal experiences of the storyteller, the parent, as well as for the interaction of the individual with other people who may have different intentions, purposes, or points of view on the topic of the parent's story. So continue within phase 5, there were 3 parts. I've just mentioned the first part, which is interaction. Now there was continuity, and that referred to the analysis of the text for information about past events, past experiences of the storyteller. In addition, it was an analyze for present experiences, which illustrated actions in an event or actions to occur in the future. Thirdly, we looked at the specific places in the storyteller's landscape. This involved the physical places or the sequence of places the storyteller details. And lastly, in phase 6, we came together as researchers, myself, Jamie, and Cara, and we synthesized the commonalities and the differences across the 3 parent stories.
So this is the data for participant 1. So here are cameos. So cameos are a technique that are used for reporting data in narrative studies. And this was they were suggested by McAlpine. Now they suggested that using quotes alone can lead to the context or the voice being lost. And a way to counteract this is to summarize each story into 100 to 350 words. Now, these short stories preserve the complexity of the individual's experience and allow the participants' stories to be published. So we're just going to show them here. I'm going to click on them and just give you some time to read through it. I'll move on very shortly. Now, this is part of the 3D approach that Dan just spoke about. The 3D approach ensured that we kept a holistic analysis of each individual story. And this is an example. So here's an example of the P1's 3D analysis. Now the tables are massive because of the amount of data that we had. So this is kind of just a snapshot of what we did. And it allowed us to think of the different parts of how the stories interacted, For example, being prompted to think about the situation and place really highlighted that boundaries between home and school have been blurred. And this was because of the amount of time that they spent away from school and the impact of the exclusions really being felt at home. And here's some quotes just at the bottom. I think these are some quotes that are quite hard-hitting in some ways. You know, for me, as a parent, as a mother, I really feel like I failed him. And that's, you know, just sitting there and reflecting on that, the impacts that these exclusions have, and it goes beyond the young people.
Okay, here's a story of P2, the parent number 2, which we'll see their cameo appear on the screen as well. So take time and read through.
I'll move on shortly.
Okay, so from the 3D analysis, we can see P2's anger and sense of injustice around the treatment of her child, which led her to believe that her child was being prejudged and basically stigmatized. Apart from the Senko, the one adult in the school, other school staff seem to have a fixed negative view of her child from her point of view. So at the time of her telling her story, there was a change in fortune for her son. He managed to find a placement, which served as a stark contrast to his past experiences of her past experience of the persistent calls and emails regarding the child's behavior and exclusions. Because at the new placement, it seemed that he was able to form strong relationships, have positive experiences, and also opportunity for respite when needed. And I've just picked out a few quotes from her story which really capture her feeling that she didn't have a voice to advocate for her child. And even looking at this quote where it says, I'm constantly getting phone calls. It's just sending them home, or, you know, it's not always they've done this or and done that. We need to talk. They have been excluded. So you can see this parent's point of view and how there was a lack of a restorative attitude towards this child from this parent's point of view, and how that really affected life for herself and her son.
So here is participant 3, their cameo. 15 currently, diagnosed with autism at 7. Sorry, it's quite hard to read. So exclusions were usually granted for not following instructions. Participant 3's belief was that the exclusions were explained by a failure to understand a child's needs, impacted by lots of changes in school. And then this resulted in, this led to, over 4 years, breakdown in trust between school and home as the exclusions continued. Exclusions from participant 3's point of view were explained why some of his anxious behaviours resurfaced, described it as post-traumatic stress. And a similar to Dan's story, that in this new setting, in this new school, seeing confidence, self-esteem building and hitting some important milestones.
I'll move on shortly.
So this is the 3D analysis for participant 3. And as has been stated, this is a very, very tiny part of what was a very huge table. One thing that was, lots of interesting things, but one thing that was particularly interesting is if we go to across the top interaction and go down to personal, what we noticed with participant 3 was that there was a shift there. She described making the decision to change over time how she represented herself during reintegration meetings. So initially, it was she was very keen to work together and listen, but as time went by and her feelings were that the school were continuing not to meet her child's needs, then the relationship broke down. P3 did say to us, she described telling herself to just sit here and be quiet. And a selection of quotes here. Again, Senko, as Dan said before, Senko seemed to provide some care there, took him under her wing. He was sort of protected from everything around him. The middle quote, we didn't have a reintegration meetings. This was for the final exclusion when he was permanently excluded because it was unofficial. I didn't know that it was illegal until Autism Outreach said. And then this one hit particularly hard at the end was when P3 said it was almost as if he was being punished for being autistic.
So as part of our analysis and furthering on from the 3D approach to provide a rich data set, we decided to look at 5 areas in the stories: the characters, main events, significant shifts in the story, positioning, and the impact of exclusion. So positioning will be covered later by Cara. But as you can see in the four other areas on this table, this is again a condensed version without specific examples. But we wanted to show you how we analyze the data, and this table has helped us compare the story whilst keeping them individual. There are many similarities which will be discussed on the next slide, but there were also some differences. For example, one story had less characters, but this could be partly down to the fact that the student is now 18, compared to the other 2 who are younger and currently going through the exclusion process. The significant shifts are very different across all stories, which shows that despite the students having different experiences, they have similar outcomes. The narratives around the main events was that exclusions were unfair, but as expected, there were a variety of reasons and precursor events that led to these exclusions. You can also see that each story contained at least one move to an alternative provision. The narrative across the impact of exclusions was varied. All 3 came to expect exclusions and were no longer shocked by them. However, there were varying degrees of emotional impact. One of the stories went into particular detail of the emotional struggle one young person went through, whereas one story was very much focused on how the young person felt now.
Once we'd delved into the stories and synthesized the information we had, we wanted to see if there were similarities across the stories. And this would help see if there were links to the literature that we'd read, and give us maybe some action points to really make a difference. As you can see, there are lots of similarities across the stories. All 3 participants believe the schools didn't understand their needs. and which led to them not being met. These reasonable adjustments that were in place were attributed to the high number of exclusions. Now, all three children, the young people, wanted to be at school. They enjoyed school and they wanted to be with their friends. One participant described their child as being very isolated now, I guess, which really shows the impact of these exclusions. All three participants believed or said it felt like schools were using these fixed term exclusions to justify a permanent exclusion. And they felt like this was almost inevitable, that it was leading to this. Now, this is obviously the construct of the parent, and we cannot say this is what happened, but it did lead to a breakdown in the breakdown of trust from the parents to the school. And the issue here is the lack of, I guess, communication and collaboration with home and school. All three participants received support from external agencies. However, this was with a varying degree of success. So 2 participants spoke very highly of the agencies that were involved and said how much of a difference they made. However, 1 participant had support in a less official way as they worked closely with such professionals. They spoke of how the advice that was given often contradicted what the school said, and this left them feeling really powerless. The other 2 participants said that the external agencies almost became advocates for the family, and it helped them feel listened to. And as you can see, there are also similarities that came up across 2 stories. For example, the stories about a negative impact of exclusions on the young person and their family. And 2 of the stories also spoke of the school not properly or officially recording the exclusions.
So onto our discussion. So in terms of our roles as researchers, we viewed the stories as co-constructions between us and the interviewees. And we do continue to feel an immense sense of responsibility to preserve the stories as they were. And we hope that comes through in how we've presented the data. In terms of previous literature, we found that our findings linked strongly with those in the previous literature. So for instance, in this paper by Parker et al. In 2016, they identified 28 sub-themes when discussing school exclusions with parents. And we actually found evidence for 19 of those sub-themes across our 3 stories. Examples are a sense of parental guilt and lacking control, querying the function of exclusions themselves if they were happening repeatedly, and the theme of hiding exclusions from data, or at least the exclusions not being visible in the data. Our study also supported the finding that the impact of being excluded from school can go beyond education, affecting emotional well-being in the home, a sense of identity, relationships, and also perceptions about the future. In terms of positioning, which Dan touched upon, we also noticed how our participants positioned the characters in their stories, including themselves. The positioning of themselves seemed to depend at least partially on that clarity of communication from the school. And this actually seemed to determine to what extent the parents felt they had agency in the process. The school was always positioned as holding all the power, such as deciding the terms under which the child returned to school. And all 3 of our parents felt like their child was positioned as a problem and that their child's right to education was in jeopardy. Oh, sorry, it's still me. In terms of what this means for schools and EPs, we do believe that hearing stories like these, that they're likely to raise questions for schools and EPs. For example, are exclusion policies really ensuring that consequences are applied fairly? And that could be queried. Do exclusions fulfill their function of presumably improving behaviour for children with SEN in particular, or without SEN? We think ourselves that a good first step would be to be examining schools' exclusion policies and then considering whether it's at odds with their inclusion policy and to what extent are long-term consequences of being excluded taken into account within these policies. Is the culture of the school designed in a way that celebrates the full spectrum of neurodiversity? And actually, is there space to expand these norms as they are? So that's more to do with schools, but in terms of EPs, educational psychologists, for us, these stories really re-emphasize that the collaboration of adults around a child is critical. And importantly, that we should not always assume that that is definitely happening. EPs could also carry out systemic work, so things like training and sharing good practice, as well as supporting with the process of examining school policies. And they could also be advising schools on their exclusion processes, promoting things like restorative approaches and supporting managed moves with integrity. So looking at a critique, we look towards ontology, which is one of our favourite words at UEL. So what we did, we adopted a particular ontology or a worldview for our research. And this worldview was one in which we assume that reality is subjective and that we each view the world through a different lens. And that lens has been socially constructed through upbringing, language, discourse, culture, etc. And so from that, we describe our data and our analyses as trustworthy rather than true, which was logical given that our research question was about the narratives of parents, so eliciting parents, how they've constructed the events that have happened around them and to them. In terms of limitations, we were at all times, we tried our best to be mindful about us imputing our own meaning, particularly because, as I'm sure you're all aware from how we've spoken, these stories were very emotional and they invoked our shared value of social justice. And how we sought to manage this was by challenging each other as a team. So I remember an example where we were talking about a participant's use of the word battle and actually what was underlying that choice of language. Another limitation was that we only had one interview per participant. It would have been ideal to have had 2 sessions to really establish that mutual trust and respect and to reduce the likelihood of inhibiting the act of narration, although we do believe that there was a lot of data and it did flow well. In terms of future research, besides the theses we need to do as part of our doctorate, we did talk about possibly integrating a series of interviews from all the key adults around the child and the child themselves, which would create this sort of polyvocal narrative, and then we could rerun the analyses afterwards. And also in the future, we are thinking about how we could bring narratives like these to a wider audience, such as yourselves. I think I speak for all of us when we say we did feel quite affected by what we learned, and we consider these narratives to have brought knowledge to the surface, whether it was re-emphasizing other knowledge that has come before or whether it's new knowledge. And what we know, classic Francis Bacon quote, is that knowledge can bring power. And to highlight one example that's relevant to our study, we do believe that knowledge around legal rights could be empowering everybody involved in this process that's thinking about what can we do to be empowering parents, children, and school staff as well. We hope that perhaps our research can do that in some form. That is the end, I think, is it?
Yep, just references now. So here are the references and that is it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn my light on because it's gone very dark. So I really hope that you've enjoyed listening to this research. I'm aware that there has been one question asked. If you had been contacted by one of these parents before their child had been permanently or fixed term excluded, how would you have supported them based on what have you learned from this? I don't know if either of you have anything to say. I think the biggest thing for me is understanding the needs and helping schools meet those needs. That was a big thing that came from the parents. So that can be through consultation, through dynamic assessment, lots of different avenues.
I think as well, it's sorry, Jamie, were you adding?
No, go for it.
I think it's so important to establish what exactly has happened in the most neutral sense. So a description, being very mindful of the language that's being used, because if things have escalated to a point where there's a possibility of exclusion, then that suggests that anxieties may be high, emotions may be high, people could be at crisis point, thinking neurologically what's firing in the brain, and actually, is everybody who was involved and might have been effective, is everybody in that calm, regulated state? And using language to describe events, and thinking about perhaps using the most neutral language possible. So rather than maybe a word like attack, you know, it would be thinking exactly about what happened. This person walked over to this person. You see what I mean?
Yeah. I think for me, it would be making sure that the parents know their rights. I mean, even right now in placement, I have a parent who was whose child is facing a fixed term exclusion, and and she didn't really have an idea of the school's behavior policy, not a clear idea of what the behaviors he had done, and how that led to disruption in the classroom. And so it was about clarifying that in consultation, and also just having an appreciative view of the child as well, you know, trying to sort of change the narrative. Like, I mean, you know, show a unconditional positive regard, in the line of Carl Rogers. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Another one here is, can you share what you will take forward into your own practice? For me, I think I've always had an interest in exclusions, and I think it's always been something that's very relevant to my practice, and always been something that I've reflected on. And even now, I'm looking at restorative approaches, and I've been on some training to help with that. And then I think from that, I've kind of taken that I want to have a more proactive involvement in preventing these exclusions and helping young people feel listened to, feel heard as well, but ensure that parents also get their say and feel like they have a voice. And I think through consultation, that is really important. I don't know if either of you have anything else to add.
I mean, there's so much of it we're taking forward, but kind of to echo what you were saying, Jamie, about as a reminder to be person-centered, that every situation is complex. It's preceded by a complex situation, and it is also followed by a complex situation. And bearing in mind that everybody will have a different view on a situation, but actually what is important is the child and meeting their needs. Of course, taking into account as well the safety and the needs of other children too, and thinking in a very person-centered way. What's the child's view on this? The behavior, what's it communicating? Always thinking of behavior as communication. Is that an unmet need? And if there are issues of communication between home and school, it's coming back to that common objective. What do we all want here? Are we all on the same page? I think that's
I think you're right. Just to add on to that, I was just thinking about how I would be ensuring that the key adults around the child are actually collaborating to meet the needs of the child, and as well as that, always thinking of behavior as a function of a person in a certain context. Again, as you just mentioned, you know, thinking about what are they trying to achieve through this behavior? What function does it serve for them? And how are they getting their needs met? Yeah.
Brilliant, both. Thank you so much. One final question before we go. I'm interested if any conflicts between the TEP and researcher roles came up internally during the interviews with parents, and how you manage this. I don't recall any conflicts that came up, so unless you two can remember something that I didn't. So no, luckily we didn't have any conflicts. And while there were emotive stories, you know, the parents unfortunately were quite used to telling the story, I think, and were quite well versed in talking about them. And
while we were going back over the data for this presentation, this idea of keeping a paper trail. So I think 2 of our parents, it was very much, but I have all these emails, I have a whole folder of this stuff, as if there was a need to justify everything when we were there to sort of listen to the story. And it was almost like feeling like, this was our sense, feeling like they need to demonstrate that this actually did happen. Whereas actually for us, it was more about their reality, and their reality is their reality as they are describing.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for listening. Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, yeah, I'm just reading the comments. Yeah, thank you for your kind words. Yeah, it was a lot of work, and yeah, I'm glad you appreciate it.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Follow us on Twitter. We're all on Twitter. Follow us, yeah.
Oh, yeah, we should share our handles. Dan, what's your Twitter handle?
Mine's Dan the Ed Psych. Yeah.
That's a good name. Jamie, what's yours?
I can't remember. I think it might be Jamie Allen Tep, but I'm not sure. What about you, Cara?
I remember mine wasn't what I wanted it to be because I put it in the wrong box. So it's Perty. So it's Pirtti, the first part of my last name, Perty Tep. I quite like it now. I've stuck with it.
Thank you all so much. I hope you have a lovely evening.
All right. Yeah. Take care.
You found benefit from this. Listen to us.